Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure to have with us once again Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Always glad to be here.
We often discuss different possibilities for your political career, and you've countered by asking about my political career.
Well, I think I'm going to hold
myself in a base for now.
Well,
I think both of us have to be drafted. We'd have to have some people that would say, we want you, let's say, in somewhere on the city council or something.
Well, let's start more ambitiously than that. And I'll give you a wonderful little constitutional tidbit here.
Yes.
That the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the United States House of Representatives, does not need to be a member of the House of Representatives.
Well, all right. On that note, we can maybe discuss
Yes.
that. So if we put aside our political possibilities and maybe discuss what's going on in the nation's capital. So we have a pretty unusual turn of events that are happening there now. Normally the parties kind of get together, they have a caucus, and they sort of pick their leader, and without much to do about it. And so now there's a lot of difficulties, the Republicans finding a way to get a majority of votes for one candidate or another. And maybe you could start out from an historical point of view. It's been over 100 years since this has happened, and we can talk about some of the dynamics about the American political system that make this happen.
Well, that's actually my little bon mot about not needing to be a member of the House kind of feeds into that, because the only thing that the Constitution says about that, and I quote, "The House shall choose their Speaker." It doesn't say that the Speaker has to be a member of the House. It's really, and since we have seen in this same last week, this is just an aside, the death of former Pope Benedict the 16th, the requirements for the College of Cardinals, you do not need to be a priest or a bishop to be elected to the College of Cardinals.
Is that right?
Yes, there have been laypersons who have been
really
chosen.
over the 2 millennium, they've had some lay people.
They have occasionally done so. But so in this case, that's all the Constitution has to say about it. And so it's done by majority vote,
yes,
which means technically the party in opposition has a say-so as well.
Yes.
Now, I'm not up on the actual House rules, but given that the Republicans only have a 4-vote majority right now, if the Republicans just simply can't agree on someone, I'm wondering if there is some sort of procedural mechanism whereby if the Democrats all voted as a bloc, they could elect the Speaker, even though they're the minority party for this coming Congress.
Well,
there must be something in the rules preventing that.
Well, presumably one of the things going on, the reason this is such a sought-after position, besides the accolades, maybe you get your own jet plane, whatever else, is the Speaker has a lot of power and is in line, the third person, I think, in line for the presidency if
Correct.
something happens.
Yes.
It's a lot of power, and they've set the agenda pretty extraordinarily, and I think Nancy Pelosi did that, but putting people on committees, establishing committees, presumably it's just a tremendously powerful position. And the fact the Republicans are having trouble putting a person in there it doesn't bode well for them. I mean,
well, I think it reveals that what we're seeing here, and this has become ever clearer over the last 10 years, but especially since Trump became president, that we're seeing a civil war not just within the country and between the two parties, we're seeing a civil war within the Republican Party. And I don't know how it's going to shake out.
It's one reason that this happened is the government has so much power. Would people really quibble over it if they were basically running post offices? Or maybe they would. Maybe they find a reason to do it. But the aggregation of power by the federal government is extraordinary and everywhere.
It is indeed.
The regulations they propagate, and so much happens without laws being passed. The executive authority can put in people to run different kinds of commissions, and those commissions can pass rules without the say-so of Congress and do all kinds of things. It would be interesting to see the number of rules that have been passed recently and regulations. Mm-hmm. It's often said that's something that has a major impact on the economy. But can anyone say? And presumably the Republicans would try and stop that or hedge executive power as they could. I don't know how successful they would be, but they could do something. So that would be one point about it. And the second one is our two-party system appropriate for the rest of the world? Are there other countries, other nations that only have two parties? Is it the parliamentary style more common? And how many nations have a model similar to ours?
Well, if you look at the former member states of the British Empire or the British Commonwealth, they tend to be two-party systems. That's where the two-party system tends to be the most prevalent. I doubt it's historical accident that that's happened, but the idea of a party in power and what is traditionally known as the loyal opposition, loyal to the constitutional system, to the basic system of government, but not necessarily loyal to the current administration. So that's where you get this concept of a almost paradoxical phrase, loyal opposition. What the parties do, or what the parties are designed to do, is to effect compromise within themselves. And then, of course, the second stage would be compromise between the parties. There are, if not constitutional, certainly long-standing political devices designed to promote that type of compromise between parties, the filibuster being probably the most prominent example of that. But I think you're seeing so much fragmenting of political ideology these days that the parties are having a little trouble with that. Now, I think that the Democratic Party, over the last 40 years or so, has done a lot better job of within itself working out those compromises. Now, I think that's come at the expense of the Democratic Party moving sharply to the left with regard, if you use as a reference point the traditional American mainstream. Now, not all Democrats went there. I don't know if you remember the Blue Dog Democrats of around 15 or 20 years ago.
They're an extinct species.
They're an extinct species. Then in the Republican Party, going back to starting probably around the time of the moral majority in the late 70s, the early 80s, the mechanism that got Ronald Reagan elected, the most conservative president that we had in 50 years up to that point. And that ultimately produced, I think, Donald Trump, the real extreme right-wing, extreme nationalistic, and I would say extremely intolerant branch of the Republican Party. Whereas the mainstream Republican Party, I think, probably has stayed closer to the center than either of the others, the Democratic Party as a whole or this radical right wing that we see in the Republican Party. So what we're seeing right now is that radical right wing Republican group fighting what they refer to as the rhinos, the Republicans in name only, that they view as too moderate for control of, I think, what you can only call the soul of the Republican Party.
Do you think, just looking at the diversity in the country, more diversity, a lot of people have immigrated to the country, and there's maybe increasing inequality. So is there an argument to say the polarity of the country is become more extreme for those reasons? Therefore, the parties have become more extreme rather than just the whimsy of politicians. So if you dislike the your economic circumstances or the national order that produces this inequality, and you require largesse from the government just to maintain your life, then it would appear that many people would feel very comfortable in the Democratic Party. And on the contrary, if you're, let's say, a Republican, maybe of European descent, traditional values, and you feel like those values are under assault, then you sort of go that direction. It's particularly as the country adjusts its past history and comes to grip with slavery, the Civil War, and the fact the country could have acted in evil ways in the past, and digesting all of that, that would be to me one reason this polarity is there. And the job for politicians, in my opinion, is to bridge the polarity and soften it. It's not healthy, in my opinion, it's not healthy to have such a terrible political tension. I mean, are we 3 months away from another riot or another breakdown or some kind of political encumbrance for the nation to fulfill its world responsibilities? It's distressing to me. Can you comment on that?
Well, yes. Well, this idea that the parties or I should say politicians should bridge the gap, as you put it, that's kind of an idyllic sort of New England town hall view of things. And you have to remember that if you were in New England at the time, the concept of the town hall and congregationalism were becoming the reality. And they never were, of course, the perfect reality. But
yes.
but I mean, there was a truth to it. That the people there did share common culture. They shared common genes, they shared common background. They were all not just from England, they were from particular locations in England. They were on more or less the same page in terms of religion. They were on more or less the same page in terms of economics. I think where things tend to start going off the rails are when we wrote the new Constitution. When many of the commercial classes decided that under the Articles of Confederation they couldn't develop national markets to their satisfaction, so they wanted more national control. But then the argument came up that there had never been a republic that was physically as big as we were talking about at that point. And James Madison wrote his well, I suppose some people would say famous, it might be better to say his notorious 10th Federalist, in which he argued that the different factions all over the United States in their fighting with each other would tend to neutralize each other, null each other out, and we would somehow come to a middle ground. We have to remember that writing in that context, Madison was a propagandist. He was not saying that necessarily because he believed it. He was saying that because he hoped other people would believe it and vote for the Constitution. But yeah, compromise, that's not what most people want to do. As one of my law professors once said, that remember, your client does not want justice. Your client wants to win. And I think that the politicians are, in the last 50 years, really reflecting that factiousness that we're seeing.
Well, human nature being what it is, I can accept the fact it's hard to be a compromiser, mm-hmm. But in every circumstances, I think people appear and they're needed. Mm-hmm. So if you've ever been in any kind of, dispute involving other people, if someone steps forward to, let's see if we can work this out, and that's necessary. So just to make our world work, we have to have these compromises, and if we don't, the road goes to war, distress, all kinds of terrible things happen. And you could say, in many terrible sets of circumstances, why wasn't there a compromiser in evidence? Mm-hmm. And I think I'll make one comment about the Civil War, that the fact that James Buchanan, who was the president before the great terrible distress, there are ways that compromises could have happened. There are lots of ways things could have happened. And it would appear to me the president had some responsibility to do that. It didn't work. And you could just go right down the line about possibilities of trying to affect some kind of pathway out of these encumbrances. What can you do to do that? And if you can't find a way to do it, then that's a terrible problem. And a politician, mm-hmm. I take your point, their job is to act like an attorney for a particular group of people. Mm-hmm. Well, that's one job. But the other job is to pursue the best interests of the nation. And if they can't do it, we've had this conversation mm-hmm. before, then it evolves to the judicial branch. If they're the only people that can be the compromisers here, and they maybe have to do it with the decisions they make. A good example might be the issue with no one can get together on the immigration arrangements on the southern border. And so the Supreme Court just said, well, okay, we'll hold it in abeyance. I'm not so sure that was, from a narrow legal point of view, an appropriate thing to say. However, somebody has to bridge the gap, and so who's that going to be? And it should be politicians.
Well, there's a lot there to unpack.
I know, I gave you a lot.
And speaking of holding in abeyance, let's hold the entire judicial branch in abeyance, because I think that's a completely, that would take a program
Yes.
for us to do it on its own. I could argue it's not their job to compromise; it's their job to say what the law is, and if that's
unless a higher calling.
Well,
appears.
as Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. once said, if the people, this is a democracy, if the people want their country to go to hell, it's my job to help them do it. But let's keep it, before we get to the court. Yeah, it's nice for you to say you're a senator or a member of the House or something, that I have a higher calling, that I have a greater duty to my constituency. Well, I hope that comforts you once you have cast the decisive vote your profile encourage, and in your very next election are voted out by your constituency, because they're not going to have any patience with that. Realistically, if you could get what you wanted, if you could get exactly what you wanted without having to compromise, without having to water down your position, would you do it? I think it's human nature to say, well, yes, of course.
Yes.
And so when you see compromise break down, it is because either you believe you can get what you want without having to make a deal with these people who either you detest those people or you detest their positions, or you've adopted a scorched earth policy, which we've also seen people do. Let's burn it down. If we can't get one. I've been doing a lot of reading lately on the Japanese surrender at the end of World War II.
Yes.
And the number of high-ranking officials in the cabinet who were saying to the bitter end, let's burn it down, let us die as a nation.
Yes.
And Churchill said that 4 years earlier. He said, if this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when the last of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. If you've got people like that in Congress who are literally willing to burn it down, and we have seen that happen in our own history, 1861 to 65. I don't know what to do. The trick is education. We have to realize how disastrous that can really be, which I think you would agree with me on that.
Well, maybe the seduction of political office is so overwhelming. I guess I'm sure it is. You're there, people are bringing you coffee, they're genuflecting when you walk in the room. Money can somehow come into your tin cup, adulation. Humans, I would imagine, will have a hard time to walk away from that. And in fact, they rarely do. And even if they leave office, they stay in Washington and do well financially. I hope I haven't offended anyone by saying that. Seems to be a reasonable thing to say.
Well, I think that the majority of members of Congress are millionaires, if not when they get there, certainly when they leave. And not just millionaires, but multimillionaires.
Maybe their mother-in-law is also. So
Yes,
certain selected family members get the largesse of the
office.
Course. But one point I wanted to make was what I respect is particularly the Brits, when they feel like they're not in sync with their country, or they feel like they've violated some arcane arrangement, they resign. It's quite common. Well, I feel like I just can't stay in the Parliament, or I don't have the confidence of whatever. I'll just back away. And it seems to be interesting with the present difficulty with finding the Speaker of the House. I think in the Brits, pretty much somebody gives up after a while. And they say, well, okay, it doesn't look like this is going to work, and for the good of the nation, I've just resigned. And we've seen that happen recently with prime ministers.
Yes.
They go through a little, if you try and stay in office, it's going to cause all kinds of bad things. And so for the good of the nation, it would be appropriate to leave office. And that resonates with the Brits. That happens all the time. And it doesn't seem, I guess the seduction of Washington is more that of London, and it's just, I'm never leaving here. Once I'm here,
one phenomenon,
I've tacked my feet to the wall. I'm never leaving.
One phenomenon that really bothers me, and it doesn't happen often, but when it does, it really bothers me, is when you see someone in Congress change her or his political affiliation purely in order to hang on to that seat. So, for instance, Joe Lieberman, who moved from Democrat to Independent, Arlen Specter, who went from Democrat to Republican to Democrat. Just in the last month, Congressman from Arizona, or Congresswoman from Arizona, whose name I want to say...
Is that the senator? She became an
independent. Yeah, the senator became an independent. Yes. And it's like the principle is not important. The need for me to for the people to have a representative who reflects their will is important. What's important is for me to do whatever is necessary to hold on to this. Now, they'll justify it by saying, well, this is who I've really always been, and the people who elected me understood that, or the party I didn't leave the party left me, or think of the seniority that my constituents will lose if I get voted out and they replace me. But it's the lust for power. What can I say? And a lot of the Constitution is focused on how do we rein in this lust for power that people who are drawn to power have.
The humans have it.
Yes.
I mean, so it's not. I think it's a normal instinct, and
Yes.
that's a point I make a lot, or try to, is the human brain is a very rigid kind of structure. It went through its evolutionary sculpturing a couple 100,000 years ago, and it has not easily changed over that length of time. So our brains are just great for Neolithic struggles, killing cave bears, stealing food if you have to stay alive, for the alpha males, being friends with the girls, whatever they're up to here. But that's hardwired in our neuronal structure, and it just reappears time and time again. So the same difficulties in human behavior are a recurring theme, and they provoke a cyclical view of history, in my opinion. So we're going through this repetition of issues, and what seems to happen, we just blunder into some kind of hellish arrangement, and without understanding that our brain is giving us limits to our behavior. And if you're in a discussion with someone over some issue, so let's say you're discussing, you're in Washington and you're trying to come up with a new Speaker of the House, and the person wants to stay on, and you could say, I totally understand that. Of course you want to stay on. And there's no doubt about it. Let's do some kind of deal, if we can't do it any other way, since I can understand your motivation is largely self-serving, as most motivations are, not totally, but it's certainly pretty hardwired. Well, we'll give you some money. You want to be ambassador to Venezuela, whatever you'd like. We have to do some kind of deal, but if nothing happens, if you won't surrender on this, you're going to get some terrible nip. And we regret giving you that nip, but that's sort of a Jeremy Bentham kind of for the common good. I don't know if that's having that and just understanding on any human struggle or controversy. Well, that's what there, and of course people want they want things to be the best for them. On the other hand, culturally, I think if our nation understood more than it does, that the calls for righteousness are often misplaced, because each side is going to claim they have a righteous view, Gott menus, that's just out there, and so each side thinks they're morally correct, and when they play the moral card, they don't totally understand that it's in their best interest to play the moral card. They're going to get some benefit from it that's past the morality of the situation. I don't know how well I said that. But understanding just that little epistle would be a useful thing if people in positions of power recognized it.
Well, the problem is that the people who could, edge you onto the sidelines are usually not the people that are serving with you in Congress. Now, to a degree, they are.
I mean, we're urging you to be on the side. We're sitting here in our little.
I mean, if McCarthy could actually become Speaker, yes, he could send a lot of people to the janitorial committee as opposed to the Armed Services Committee.
And he may plan on
he may well do that.
He may be telling people right now that's what's going to happen.
Yes, but ultimately, you as a member of Congress, the people who put there are your constituents. And we haven't talked much in this episode about how the different electoral districts all over America are polarizing tremendously. I mean, the number of so-called safe seats
done so by the whims of the state legislatures, and which the courts seem to be supporting.
Yes, and there's a very big case on that coming up about whether or to what degree is the state legislature the final word on redistricting, and we will be seeing that decided in June probably by the Supreme Court, and that's going to be a big one. So yes, as long as you've got that polarization, and it's exactly the same type of polarization we saw in the years leading up to 1860, 1861. Now, it's not straight north-south. It's much more nuanced than that, but it's there. And the best possible thing it can lead to is deadlock in Congress. So the worst thing it can lead to, well, we're seeing some of that right now with this impossibility of electing a speaker.
And I think another issue out there is the government getting its funding bill through in these contentious times.
Another continuing resolution if we're lucky.
And to continue to run up the national debt. So this is another thing that goes on with the political process. When it said, well, you know what, I want to stay in Washington. My objective is to be here another decade or whatever, half a decade. I'll be here a decade. During that period, I'm going to get $1 zillion, and then the next decade after that, I'll get all kinds of $1 zillion. And I think I'd like to be ambassador to a really nice place, Bermuda, possibly. Mm-hmm. Maybe I get an appointment there, and I want my brother-in-law to go on to whatever commission he wants to go on. And these are ambitions that people have, and it's a very short-term viewpoint. So if you say, well, let's look at the long-term story, we're going to have to do something about these structural problems the country has. We're going to have to do something about the national debt. We're going to have to protect the reserve currency issues. We're going to have to do all kinds of things that are going to be initially painful, but it will be for the good of the country. And on the other hand, you're not going to be here for a decade. Instead, you've got a good job selling home freezers. Nothing wrong with selling home freezers. I've unsuccessfully done that in my past, very unsuccessfully. But it's another story.
Well,
but the takeaway message is that you have to have people that are going to look after the best interests of the nation, or try to, and there are just not enough of them around, nor will voters accept that.
Well, the problem is, what if what I think, you define the good of the country, I think for the good of the country we ought to shoot every immigrant, and you think for the good of the country we ought to force every single religious body in this country to accept gays and lesbians at the positions of leadership. I mean, it goes back to culture wars. The extension of that is what I think for the good of the country is you ought to die, and what you think for the good of the country is that I ought to be thrown into the gulag. I mean, and that is terrifyingly the direction in which we're moving, a mutual intolerance.
My final comment, I think we have to go here, is looking at long-term problems that are painful short-term solutions is extremely difficult, but it's not a bad thing to try and accomplish.
I think we'll have to learn that.
On that note, thank you for being here, Buck.
It's
always good to have you here. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.